glass shattered, and my voice followed it into the dark hallway. I heard my own words repeating from Elena's phone, clipped and cruel, and they weren't the way I said them. Elena said, "You gave me the truth, Maya, and I gave it purpose." I felt the floor tilt as messages pinged in a group chat we built together, now turned into a stage. Noah said, "This isn't you, Elena," but his doubt landed on me like ash. Grace said, "Maya, breathe," and the air refused me. I remembered the night I wrote those confessions, soft and careful, and how Elena asked for them like a sister would. She said, "Your secrets are safe with me," and I believed her. Now every syllable I wrote was a knife with my fingerprints. I said, "You cut me with my own mouth," and she smiled like victory was tidy. The apartment smelled of oranges and betrayal, because I had just peeled one. The peel curled on the counter like punctuation after a scream. I said, "Why?" And Elena said, "Because silence never crowned anyone." The group chat flamed, and my name burned brightest. I slept with the phone on my chest, and woke to the sound of my name wearing new meanings. Grace said, "Take the day, Maya," and I nodded to an empty room. Noah said, "I'll call later," and later arrived with 1,000 echoes. I walked to the river because water listens without advice. Elena said, "You needed a push," and the sentence followed me like a stray dog. I remembered our first shared secret, and how we swore to keep each other's words safe. I kept mine in a box, she turned mine into arrows. I said, "You aimed at my life," and the wind took the words and hid them in the reeds. The city moved, like nothing cracked. I held my throat like a fragile jar and counted breaths. A gull laughed and I almost laughed back. I said, "I will not vanish," and the river kept the promise for me. By noon, the group chat grew another head, a copy with my name misspelled, like a trophy. Elena said, "Truth wants daylight," and she pinned my late-night journal line at the top. Noah said, "This is too far," and silence answered him with clapping emojis. Grace said, "Screens magnify cruelty," and I wanted a dimmer switch for people. I drafted apologies for feelings I actually owned. I said, "I am not sorry for healing. I am sorry you saw it as a weapon." My hands shook less when I said it out loud. I wanted to walk back years and guard every syllable. I wanted to walk forward and build a door only I could open. Elena said, "Doors are for cowards," and I wondered who taught her that. Grace met me on a bench that remembered every breakup in the city. Grace said, "If I speak, I lose her. If I don't, I lose you." I said, "You don't have to choose me," but my heart whispered, "Please." Noah called and his voice sounded like the beginning of rain. Noah said, "Elena sent the audio to my editor," and the sky lowered another inch. I said, "She turned confession into content," and the bench pressed cold into my spine. Grace said, "I'll stand up in the chat," and her fear looked like courage wearing thin shoes. I said, "If you do it for the truth, not for me." The city sighed, and a bus hissed. Somewhere a child laughed like a future I could still want. Evening folded itself around my apartment, and I lit a candle like a lighthouse for one ship. I recorded a voice memo I never meant to send. I said, "My words were soft animals, Elena, and you skinned them." The candle snapped and agreed. Noah said, "I'm here if you want me to listen," and I let the memo play into emptiness. Grace said, "I posted," and the chat's heat shifted by a degree. I heard my heartbeat in the vent, steady and stubborn. I said, "I will keep writing, but I will not hand you the knife again." The flame leaned, then stood tall. The room felt small, but my lungs learned a new shape. I still remember the first day we met in middle school, when I dropped my notebook and Elena knelt to gather the pages before I even asked. She said, "You write like the sky needs you." I laughed because who says that at 13? Years later, I trusted her with the same notebook, now filled with grown-up fears. Noah once said, "The two of you are like a team no one can beat," and I wore that truth like a medal. Grace said, "You two make the rest of us believe in forever." And I believed her. I replayed those words as I stared at the ceiling, wondering when forever became a deadline. Elena and I spent summers building scrapbooks, cutting out quotes, promising to never let them fade. I said, "We'll still be laughing about this at 60, and she nodded like she could already see it. The memory clung to me now, soft but bruising, a ghost in my throat. The summer we turned 16, Elena painted my bedroom wall with a quote from my notebook. She said, "Now your words are bigger than secrets." I felt proud and embarrassed all at once. We ate melted popsicles that stained our lips red, and I said, "This is forever ink." Noah peeked through the doorway and laughed, saying, "You too are trouble," and Grace clapped her hands like we were heroes. That wall became the backdrop of every birthday photo for years. When friends came over, Elena said, "This line belongs to Maya, but it belongs to all of us now." My chest swelled at how she lifted me up. I had no idea lifting can sometimes mean placing you on a ledge for later to push. One winter night we stayed up late making hot chocolate and promises. Elena said, "If the world ever turns on you, I'll turn it back," and I believed her without hesitation. Grace yawned but stayed awake just to say, "I'll hold both of you together when you break." Noah said, "Don't talk about breaking, nothing can split this," and we all laughed at his certainty. I wrote down our pact on the last page of my journal, and Elena kissed the corner like sealing it. That memory lives in my ribs like a lullaby turned warning. Back then, warmth meant mugs steaming between us, not words burning holes in my skin. On graduation day, we stood in caps too big and gowns too wrinkled. Elena squeezed my hand and said, "The world won't know what hit it when we step in." Noah said, "College won't break you two," and Grace said, "Distance is just a game." I said, "We'll prove them right." Cameras flashed and voices filled the air, but I only heard Elena whisper, "Your words are my shield." I smiled so wide it hurt. Looking back, maybe it was never a shield she wanted, but a sword. We rented a small cabin the summer before adulthood. The lake mirrored the sky, and Elena said, "This is what eternity looks like." We carved our names into the wood railing. Noah whistled some tune about freedom, and Grace hummed along. I said, "If this is the last time we're all together like this, then let it be enough." Elena leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "It won't be the last." The water rippled with secrets we thought would never surface. That memory glows still, though the glow now hurts like touching a flame. By morning, the rumor wore new shoes and sprinted ahead of me. Elena said, "I only shared what you already wrote," and the sentence felt like a locked door. Noah said, "Your editor wants a statement," and the word statement made me smaller. Grace said, "We can map the damage," and I pictured coastline after a storm. I walked to work, counting cracks in the sidewalk like tally marks. I said, "You didn't reveal me, Elena, you revised me," and the wind scattered the line. She said, "Revision is mercy," and I heard applause that wasn't there. Noah said, "Do not answer the chat," and my thumbs itched. Grace said, "We choose the next frame," and the future blinked like a camera waiting. The day tasted metallic. I checked the voice memo and did not press send. I said, "My words are not your ladder," and the city kept moving like it didn't hear me. At lunch I found a post with my line stripped of its softness. Elena said, "People finally felt something," and I felt nothing but heat. Noah said, "They clipped the ending that held the kindness, and the loss rang like a dropped bell." Grace said, "Context is the spine," and I stood straighter because I needed one. I drafted a reply that tasted like salt. I said, "This line was about survival, not spectacle," and I watched the cursor blink like a heartbeat. Elena said, "Spectacle pays attention," and I thought about the price. Noah said, "We can pitch the full story," and Hope tapped the window once. I closed the tab and let silence sit beside me like a stubborn friend. The cafeteria hummed, and I learned how to chew without swallowing rage. In the afternoon, the podcast invite arrived with a smiling subject line. Elena said, "You're welcome," and the words glittered like broken sugar. Noah said, they want the drama, not the truth, and my stomach answered with a hollow drum. Grace said, we say no until we own the frame, and the word own steadied me. I said, my voice is not a firework, and the office heater clicked like an answer. Elena said, this is your moment? And I asked who was holding the clock. I imagined a microphone swallowing my breath. I imagined silence building me a better room. Noah said, we can write a piece instead, and the page inside me lifted its head. Grace said, we publish on our terms, and for a second the air felt wide. Evening carried us to a bar where the lights were kind, and the music forgave mistakes. Elena said, let's clear the air, and the air held its breath. Noah said, no recordings, and a server laughed like fate was listening. Grace said, say it straight, and I set my glass down like a gavel. I said, you turned my confession into a mirror that flatters you, and her smile thinned. She said, your honesty needed an audience, and I remembered the quiet we used to share. Noah said, consent is not retroactive, and the table learned a new silence. Grace said, apologize, and return the clips, and the word, return felt like a door finally visible. Elena watched the ice melt and said nothing. The walk home tasted like rain even before the sky opened. Elena texted, you'll thank me later, and later felt like a cliff. Noah said, I'm on standby, and the phrase steadied the pavement. Grace said, document everything, and I saved screenshots like lifeboats. I said, I will not be curated by someone else, and the words warmed my coat. A siren wrote a red line across the block, and I wondered who was being rescued. Elena said, this is bigger than us. And I thought of how big small cruelties can grow. I reached my door with a key that finally knew which lock it loved. The storm began, and my chest matched its rhythm. The reveal came not as thunder, but as a knife slipped between ribs. Elena said, I gave them your recordings, and the floor vanished beneath me. Noah said, she sent them to the publisher, and my pulse broke into glass. Grace whispered, you didn't agree to this, and silence confirmed it. I said, you made me a product, and my voice cracked. Elena said, I made you relevant, and I wanted to tear relevance out of her mouth. Noah said, this crosses every line, but Elena smiled like there were no lines at all. Grace said, she betrayed the pact, and her words landed heavier than the storm outside. I said, you turned my trust into currency, and Elena shrugged like it was math. The room narrowed to her face, and I saw not my friend but a thief holding my skin. The audio file played through the laptop speakers, my voice trembling in ways I never shared beyond Elena. Elena said, it's beautiful when stripped raw, and the rawness cut me. Noah slammed his palm and said, stop this. Grace shook her head and said, Maya never consented. I said, these words were born in trust, not for stage lights, and the echo burned. Elena said, but now they live forever. And forever became a curse. I pressed pause, but the silence was already too loud. Noah said, you destroyed what you claimed to protect. Grace said, this is betrayal dressed as art, and I wanted to erase the air. Elena leaned closer and said, you'll see, it was worth it. The storm outside roared like my chest. Elena said, the audience deserves the truth. And I spat, they deserve yours, not mine. Noah said, she weaponized your heart, and the word weapon echoed. Grace said, this is cruelty, not courage, and the rain hammered approval. I said, you carried my secrets like a lantern, and then you smashed it, and Elena smirked. She said, light belongs to everyone. Noah's eyes burned with fury as he said, you sold her pain. Grace touched my shoulder and said, she doesn't see the wreckage. I wanted to claw my words back from the air. Elena's eyes glimmered like a stage spotlight, and I knew the show was already running. I stepped into the hallway, needing walls that didn't know my name. Elena followed, saying, someday you'll thank me. I said, thank you for stealing? and my laugh was a knife. Noah shouted from inside, "Leave her alone." Grace said, "Maya, breathe." I leaned on the railing and said, "You took my voice and handed it away like a gift card." Elena said, "It was meant to free you, and freedom tasted like chains." Rain spilled through the stairwell window, dripping like punctuation. I said, "You killed us, Elena," and her silence admitted the murder. Back in the room, the screen displayed my words stamped under Elena's beline. Elena said, "It needed a stronger name," and my chest collapsed. Noah said, "You didn't just betray her, you erased her." Grace said, "This is theft dressed as loyalty." I said, "You took my diary and signed it with your smile." Elena shrugged, saying, "The world believed it was mine." The betrayal wasn't just exposure, it was erasure. I said, "You didn't steal my story, you stole me." Her silence grew sharp as the storm reached its peak. The room felt like a grave where friendship had been buried alive. The auditorium smelled like velvet and nerves as the host announced Elena's name. She walked on stage holding my sentences like trophies polished for sale. I said, "Those are mine," but the room swallowed it whole. Elena said, "Tonight is about truth," and the crowd leaned forward. Noah said, "We don't have to stay," and my knees chose thunder. Grace said, "Stand beside your voice," and I rose. Elena read a line I wrote in the dark for no one but myself. The audience sighed as if they discovered me without me. I said, "Stop," and the microphone tasted like iron. Elena said, "Share the stage," and her smile was a blade. I said, "You took my words, trimmed their roots, and called it garden." The spotlight pinned us like moths on a velvet board. Noah said, "We have receipts," and screens woke like stars. Grace said, "Then let the room hear the rest." I inhaled and felt the door inside me unlock. Backstage smelled like cables and dust and old applause. Elena said, "You want a piece of the moment," and the insult snapped like wire. I said, "I want my words back," and my voice did not wobble. Noah said, "We have timestamps and drafts," and his phone glowed like a match. Grace said, "Consent is the spine of story," and the sentence stood straight. Elena laughed and said, "The world loves a villain." I said, "Then stop hugging the role like a prize." She said, "I made you visible," and I pointed to the crowd that had never met my context. Noah said, "Her beeline erased the source," and the paper cut deeper. Grace said, "Apologize here now, and return everything." Elena's jaw clicked like a door, not built to open. I said, "I wrote to heal, not to brand." The stage manager knocked, and the air tightened. Elena said, "You won't ruin this," and I said, "I will correct it." We stepped back under the lights and the room tilted toward heat. Elena said, "A duet," and I shook my head. I said, "A correction," and the host faded into carpet. Noah said, "Play the original memo," and the speakers filled with my midnight heartbeat. My voice arrived shaky but whole, carrying context like a lantern. Grace said, "Listen to the part that was cut," and the missing tenderness returned like rain on ash. Elena said, "The edit was art," and the audience shifted. I said, "Art without consent is theft wrapped in applause." Murmurs grew teeth and chewed through her smile. Noah said, "Here are the file histories," and images bloomed on the projector. Grace said, "Return her name to her story," and the room breathed one held breath. I finished the line Elena stole and set it down gently. The silence after was the loudest sound I had ever owned. The crowd asked for answers, and Elena offered mirrors. She said, "Envy is honest," and the confession struck me sideways. I said, "You could have asked for help instead of a crown." Noah said, "She lifted your words to step over you," and the metaphor fit too well. Grace said, "You can make this right," and the room waited like a jury. Elena's eyes watered but did not soften. She said, "I was tired of being almost." I said, "You were never almost to me," and the hurt pulsed. She said, "They never heard me until I spoke as you," and the ugliness stood naked. I said, "Give it back and start as yourself." The audience hummed like distant thunder agreeing. Noah said, "Say her name with credit." And Grace nodded. Elena closed her eyes and said nothing. The silence bent toward breaking. The final swing arrived with no music. I said, "Choose now," and the room held its breath for us. Elena said, "I can't let go," and the rope burned both palms. Noah said, "Then we will," and he stepped to my side like a verdict. Grace said, "We publish the full account," and the plan felt like clean air. I said, "You will remove my lines and return every file," and the mic did not tremble. Elena said, "You'll wreck my career," and I answered, "You wrecked our life." The crowd shifted into a single spine of witness. I said, "This ends tonight," and the lights hummed approval. Noah squeezed my shoulder and the ground steadied. Grace's eyes met mine like a promise signed. Elena lowered the book and finally looked smaller than her shadow. I said, "You don't get to speak as me again," and the curtain began to fall. The morning after felt like waking inside broken glass. Headlines carried my name and Elena's together, stitched by conflict. Noah said, "The truth reached them, but truth felt too heavy to wear." Grace said, "You survived the fire," and I searched for proof in my own hands. Elena's silence online roared louder than her speeches. I said, "She wanted the spotlight. Now she drowns in it." Noah said, "You took back your voice, and still my throat ached." Grace said, "Scars prove survival," and I let her words rest like a bandage. I said, "Survival is not peace," and the kettle whistled sharp. Outside, the city hurried as though nothing cracked. My chest still carried shards of last night's storm. The article correction came at noon, my name restored beneath lines Elena once claimed. Noah said, "It's official now," and relief brushed me without staying. Grace said, "Your story stands in your ink," and I traced the letters as if they might vanish. I said, "Vindication tastes bitter, because trust once cracked cannot be glued whole." Elena's beeline disappeared like a shadow dragged off stage. I said, "I don't feel like I won." Noah said, "Justice doesn't heal, it just records." Grace nodded and said, "Healing is your work, not theirs." My phone buzzed with messages of support, yet the ache remained. I closed the browser and let silence breathe for me. Afternoon rain fell steady as we sat in the cafe corner, where Elena and I once shared secrets. The chair across from me was empty now, haunted by echoes. I said, "She was my sister in everything but blood," and the ache hollowed deeper. Noah said, "She chose envy over love," and the words felt true but cruel. Grace said, "You still grieve her," and I nodded because grief does not ask permission. I stirred my coffee until it went cold. I said, "I miss who she was before the crown," and silence agreed. Elena's absence was louder than her betrayal. Noah touched my wrist and said, "You'll outgrow this wound." Grace said, "Even ashes can feed new soil," and I clung to that seed. That night, Elena called once. I watched the phone ring without lifting it. I said, "Her voice is not mine to carry anymore," and the silence became armor. Noah said, "She will want forgiveness," but forgiveness felt like surrender. Grace said, "You owe her nothing," and her firmness steadied me. I let the call end, the screen fading into dark. I whispered, "We buried our friendship already," and the words felt final. Outside, the storm returned like a mirror of our history. I said, "I will keep my words in my own mouth now," and my chest loosened. Noah nodded, and Grace reached for my hand. The phone rang again, and I turned it face down. The night sighed in relief. The next morning carried quiet strength. I walked to the river again, this time not to escape but to breathe. I said, "She will not shape me anymore," and the wind scattered the vow. Noah said, "You're stronger than the wound," and I let the words settle. Grace said, Write again on your own terms, and my hand itched for a pen. The water shimmered, not with betrayal but with possibility. I said, I will build from ashes, and the sentence felt like a bridge. Elena's absence no longer screamed, it whispered. I stood taller, chest open to the air. The city moved, and I moved with it. Healing had not finished, but it had begun. Morning opened like a quiet book, and I wrote the first line without shaking. Grace said, keep breathing into the sentence, and the page obeyed. Noah said, you don't owe anyone a performance, and the room softened. I brewed coffee and thought about all the doors I once left unlocked. I said, I will choose which rooms my words enter, and the echo felt kind. The city hummed, unbothered, and I matched its steadiness. Elena's name drifted past my window and did not stick. I said, I can heal and still be angry, and the anger learned how to walk beside me without dragging me down. The paragraph settled like a small, strong bridge, and I crossed it. At noon, a letter arrived from Elena, ink heavy and careful. She wrote, I can't find my voice without yours, and the sentence wilted on contact. I said, return to yourself, and folded the page once. Noah said, you don't have to answer, and silence bloomed like a gentler flower. Grace said, closure is a boundary, not a door, and I felt the truth take root. I placed the letter in a drawer with past lives. I said, I released the part of me that waited, and the room brightened slightly. The drawer clicked shut like a soft verdict. I met Elena in the park, because endings deserve open air. She said, tell me how to make it right, and the wind answered before I could. I said, you can't return what you taught the world to take, and her eyes searched the ground. Noah stood far enough to be there without being between us. Grace sat near the fountain, notepad closed, witness without judgment. I placed a flash drive on the bench and said, these are my originals. They stay with me. Elena said, I am sorry, and the words arrived thin. I said, I believe you are sorry for the consequences, not the act, and her shoulders bent. The fountain kept speaking so I didn't have to. That evening I read my piece at a small venue, where the lights were kind. I said, these are the words as I meant them, and the room leaned in without hunger. Noah said, this is your house, and I believed him. Grace said, let the last line land softly, and my breath matched the cadence. I read the part about survival that Elena had trimmed into spectacle. The audience held their hands still, as if not to startle the truth. I closed the notebook and felt the floor return under my feet. Applause rose like rain that cleans, not floods. Later, by the river, the city breathed with me. I said, I lost a friend and found a boundary, and the water agreed. Noah said, you're allowed to keep what you make, and the wind carried it onward. Grace said, write the next chapter without apologizing, and my spine straightened. I placed my palm on the railing and felt the metal colder than guilt, cleaner than grief. The moon folded itself into the current, and I let go of the last splinter. I said, they didn't just betray me. They betrayed every version of us we could have been, and the night kept it safe.